We made this.
The 90s. The end of the Cold War. The Spice Girls. New Labour. Euro 96. The PlayStation. The World Wide Web. We all have our memories. Many of them will be of movies, in an era where the blockbuster truly came home, where art house prospered, where the Brit films soared, and where, in some ways, popular culture truly began. I'm AJ Black, author, writer, and podcaster, and the 90s was my decade. It was probably yours too. So join me as I head down memory lane at the movies in the 90s.
Detection of an unidentified radio source from deep space can neither be confirmed nor denied.
Whatever it is, it ain't local.
Position?
I checked interferometry somewhere in Lyra, I think.
Vega?
Can't be. It's only 26 light years away.
I want all these people out of here. Your having sent this announcement all over the world may well constitute a breach of national security.
Well, this isn't a person-to-person call. This may be an announcement to get our attention.
The president's called an emergency meeting.
You know those interlaced frames that we thought were noise? This has structure.
I'm going to recommend to the president that we militarize this project immediately.
There's no reason to believe that their intentions are hostile.
There's no proof of that.
Why don't they just speak English?
Mathematics is the only truly universal language, Senator. Buried within the message itself is the key to decoding it.
Those look like engineering schematics, almost like blueprints.
It is our belief that the message contains instructions for building some kind of machine.
A machine?
It might turn out to be some kind of a transport.
Transport. The fact is, you don't know what it does. It could be anything.
Nobody's saying this isn't dangerous.
They're gonna build it.
Who gets to go, though?
It's complicated, Ellie.
Who gets to go?
By doing this, you're willing to risk your life. You're willing to give your life and die for this. Why?
Joining me for this very first episode to discuss 1997 science fiction drama Contact is Ian Buckley, podcaster behind fellow We Made This shows We Are Starfleet and Illumination Above All, and Luke Winch, fantasy booktuber and podcaster behind We Made This Show, A Dream Given Form. You are officially the first guests on At the Movies in the 90s, guys. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be the first guests on your new podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Tony. It is also a privilege to talk about this movie, which is one I love very, very much.
I think we are all, without spoiling anything for listeners, we all love the 90s and we all love Contact especially. So yeah, I think we're going to have a very, very fun discussion about this film. But before we do, a couple of things to go through. So firstly, I want you guys to tell us a little bit about some of the things you do. So Ian, you do a couple of different podcasts. Why don't you give us a brief view of one of them, because because without spoiling too much, you're going to be on at a later date as well. So maybe we talk about the other podcast then. But why don't you talk about let's talk about We Are Starfleet and tell people a little bit about that.
Yeah, you took the words right out of my mouth. I think I will want to highlight that since we are actively coming out with episodes now. That's always a useful thing to plug. Yeah, We Are Starfleet is one of our Star Trek coverage podcasts here on the We Made This network. We are focusing on We Are Starfleet. We're focusing on Strange New Worlds at the moment, which is currently airing season 3. So yeah, tune in for all of our episode by episode breakdowns of season 3 of Strange New Worlds. And the uncertainty that's come about in the world of kind of new Star Trek and in terms of what's coming out and not coming out anymore down the line is kind of leaving us all feeling, I think, a little unmoored, a little unsettled about the future of the franchise we love so much. But we're having a good time over there right now talking about Strange New Worlds. So please check us out there.
It's a great show. It is a great show. Lots of discussion. If you're a Star Trek fan, I think you'll really love it. And it's part of the several different Star Trek podcasts we have on We Made This. And we will talk a bit of Star Trek on At the Movies in the 90s eventually. I do have The Undiscovered Country earmarked.
One of my favorites.
Yeah. I might well be back in touch. Maybe with both you guys. Maybe we could all come back and do that one. Let's see. Let's see what happens.
It's definitely one of my favourite original crew films. So, yeah.
Okay, let's do that now. Let's confirm that live, quote marks. We'll reunite later this year to do Star Trek 6, The Undiscovered Country. So yeah, that'd be brilliant.
Excellent.
Luke, then, so you've got a couple of different strings to your bow. Why don't you tell us about your booktubing and some of your book review writing this week?
Yeah, so I run a booktube channel called Luke's Book Nook, and I primarily focus on fantasy and science fiction genres, where I review different books, both traditional published and self-published, which is, it's a hugely growing market now, that the self-published fantasy and science fiction. So it's really good to help promote authors and also, review their books. I get a lot of ARCs, which is advanced reader copies, from authors who want those reviews set down before their launch, which is always helpful for them. So I do a lot of that, and then I also do a lot of what I call video essays. So just discussing different kind of book series, or discussing an author, or discussing a theme that is explored in a lot of fantasy and sci-fi. And also I'm going to be having a couple of my first author interviews as well coming up on the channel. So and then I'm also a judge for the what we call SPIFBO, which stands for, and I'm going to get this right, Self-Published Fantasy Book Blog Off, which was created by Mark Lawrence, who's a very famous fantasy author. He created this contest to basically invite 300 self-published authors across 10 judging panels, and basically it's all about knocking them down to the top 9 or the top 8 books, and then we basically judge which one's the best. And it's been going on for about 5 years, and a couple of those self-published authors have now been picked up by a publishing company. So it's been brilliant for the authors, and it's been great for us to just basically get out there and review these books. So yeah, I'm a busybody.
Fantastic.
Not a busybody in a good way.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not in a bad way.
Oh yeah, not in a bad way.
No, that's brilliant. That is all fantastic. I credit you for getting me into watching some booktube. I have dabbled a little bit in doing it myself, but I've retired it for now because I just don't really have time with everything else going on. But yeah, booktube is great fun, absolutely, and you're doing great guns on that, Luke. So yeah, long may it continue. And when you do come back on this podcast, and we already know one of the films you're going to come back on and talk about, but we'll talk a little bit about your podcasting as well. So we'll get there. So yeah, brilliant, guys. Go and check out everything, guys. These guys are up to. We'll give some links and stuff towards the end. So stay tuned for that. But before we get into the first part of our discussion, a quick reminder, you can follow me personally if you're enjoying the podcast so far, or you like what you hear by the end. And if you are fairly new to me, you can follow me on social media at AJ Black Writer on Twitter, although how long that's going to last, who knows? You might be better off going to Linktree. So Linktr.ee /AJ Black Writer, where you'll find all the links to what I'm up to and the things I'm doing. And if you want to follow We Made This as a network is all over social media as well. So you can find that on Twitter for now. You can find it on Facebook, Instagram, etc. So just type in We Made This Podcasts, and you should be able to find it. And if you are enjoying at the movies at the 90s by the end of the show, please do drop us a quick 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts, the app, or whatever podcast app you use. You might not be an Apple user. It'll just help us bump us up amongst the other podcasts that are covering the 90s and lots of other film shows and things like that, and get people listening. So we hugely appreciate that if you do. So thank you. Let's talk about the 90s though, guys. All right, that's what people are here for. So we're going to start off each week when I talk to a guest. I'm going to start them off. Every time we're going to start off with what's your favourite 90s topic. And for every guest, we're going to start off with film, and then we're going to go through different things like TV shows, music, etc. So this is the first one, so we're all going to do it today, but I will defer and go last. So, Luke, why don't you kick us off with what is your favourite 90s movie?
Okay, I'll preface this by saying that this question is stupid because it's so vast. It's such a vast question. So I'm going to
8 minutes, and you've already insulted the host. That's going to be a record, I tell you.
But I'm gonna slightly cheat because I've got two. I've got like a blockbustery option and a proper kind of piece of cinema option.
That's okay.
So my blockbuster option is Jurassic Park. I think it's it's such an era-defining movie in terms of special effects, in terms of Spielberg kind of putting himself back on the map. And just in general, just the kind of science fiction genre in general in film. I just think Jurassic Park was such an impactful film in my young life in the 90s. I remember going to cinema about 3 times, like literally 3 days in a row, just going to see it again because it was such an amazing movie. And those animatronics and that early CG, it was just groundbreaking at the time.
Yeah, totally.
And then my favourite piece of 90s, an amazing piece of cinema for me is Oliver Stone's JFK. I think it's such an incredible piece of cinema. It's just vast in scope. It's got literally nearly every single actor who was around in the 90s had some little part in this movie. And because I've always been generally interested in the JFK conspiracy and everything, all the kind of myth and legends that surround it, it was just such a film. And I also think it's still, to this date, Kevin Costner's finest performance as well.
Hard to disagree with both of those. Absolutely. JFK is fantastic. JFK is one, hopefully, we will be covering. I know that movie's in the 90s fairly soon because it's JFK's 60th anniversary of his death this November. So it seems a good time to maybe go through that one. Great choices. Ian, top those.
Well,
good luck.
I'm going to top that in true American fashion by making even more decisions that you didn't ask for. Yeah, I thought the same as Luke. I was like, I can't pick just one. So I did kind of do a similar thing where I split it into a category of kind of a like something I think of when I think a 90s movie. Not just a movie that came out in the 90s that's great, but a movie that screams, this is a 90s movie. They don't make these anymore. For me, it's 2 movies, Terminator 2 and one that we're going to be talking about again very soon, The Fugitive. Those are my 2.
Yeah, I mean, they're magnificent, aren't they? Both of them are absolutely magnificent. And as you say, we're going to be doing The Fugitive fairly soon as well on the podcast, which is exciting.
Yeah, and on the flip side of that coin, the kind of totemic 90, like art films of the 90s that I really go back to, Fargo and Boogie Nights are 2 that I think of as absolute classics for me. But honestly, I could give you a million more.
I'm sure everyone who answers this question will have that response.
I guarantee you I'll probably give you a different answer next time I talk to you.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to be slightly contrary in that sense, and I'm going to give you an answer that, I love so many 90s movies. I wouldn't be doing this podcast if I didn't, ultimately. But because this podcast is grounded in nostalgia. It is grounded in nostalgia as a man, if not middle-aged, then approaching middle-age, who is now looking back on the decades he grew up with lots of other people who grew up in the 90s, and remembering how great these films were. But I have got one that has never changed, and I don't think it ever will change, and it is probably one people frequently don't expect. Unless you have heard me on other podcasts in the past talking about movies, you might already know the answer to this. In fact, if you listen to the discourse that I do with my friend Carl Sweeney, I've probably talked about this there. But mine is 1995's Die Hard with a Vengeance.
Brilliant.
Now,
good choice.
Well, it's not one that would top anyone's list, and I wouldn't even say it is the best movie of the 1990s. I wouldn't need, for a lot of people it might not even be in their top 25, their top 50, maybe not. But this is the archetypal teenage boy action movie for me, in terms of when I watched it, in terms of why I fell in love with it, even more so than either of the previous 2. Die Hard, the original, is obviously the best Die Hard film. I'm not even going to dispute that.
Yeah.
But everything about this just fills me with the kind of joy that zips me right back to being 13 years old, 2 years under the 15 certificate on the video that I borrowed from the video shop, and watching this again and again and again. And it is one of those movies, like I'm sure it's the same for you guys and the ones you've mentioned. I could rattle off the script right here, right now, basically, because it's all in my head because I've seen it that much. So, that mine wouldn't change. Like, you could throw Jurassic Park, you could throw all these amazing films at me, but mine will always be Die Hard with a Vengeance. I'm stubborn that way. I think.
That's fair.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, that film, it has one of the best lines ever from the 90s, which is when they're trying to work out the riddle of the 7 wives with 7 whatever.
Yeah.
And
if I was going to St. Ives, yeah.
Yeah. And Samuel L. Jackson's figuring it out. And John keeps asking, well, where are the wives? And Samuel L. Jackson goes, sit in the middle of the fucking road. I don't care. It's just brilliant. That line is just gold.
It is gold. There's so many like that. They're bickering. It's one of the great bickering double acts in cinema history. So yeah, there's so much comedy in there and so much really great action. It's just wonderful for me. I love it so much. And I will say, right, this is the opening episode about the movies at the 90s, obviously. I am going to pledge this right now. Die Hard with a Vengeance will be the final episode of this podcast whenever we get there, okay? I am saving it to the very, very end, okay? So I will make that pledge now. You won't hear that until the very end. So if you really love Die Hard with a Vengeance, you got to stay, guys. You've got to stick with us for however many hundreds of episodes this is going to be, hopefully, he says, with the greatest fingers crossed in the world. Okay, so next time you guys will come on, I think it'll probably be TV shows. That tends to be the next one on the list. So
sure.
You'll have to get your thinking caps on there. So let's move on then and talk about Contact. That's what we're here for. That's what the listeners are here for in the main. Directed by Robert Zemeckis, based on a story by Carl Sagan and Andrian, and the novel by those guys, I should say. And yeah, so let's talk about our history with it then. So when did you guys first see Contact? What's your history with it? Ian, why don't you kick us off?
So this is one that I remember exactly where and when I saw it. I saw it when I was 11. I was on summer vacation with my family on this little coastal island in New England called Block Island. And very small island, and they didn't really they had like a little movie theater in town set up in like an old barn kind of space. And where we were staying, they set up a tent. So they had a tent filled with folding chairs, and they had a projector set up. It might have even been like a 16 millimeter print of Contact that we saw, because I don't remember there being like a big 35 millimeter projector in this tent. But my dad and I went. We sat on these little folding chairs, and I was absolutely riveted for 2.5 hours, and we loved it. And I enjoyed every time I watch it. This was my first time watching it since my dad passed. And so, it had like an additional resonance to it and importance. I think that it didn't really have, like, there was a weight to it that it didn't have on previous viewings. But thematically, the daughter-father relationship was one that I always really appreciated about it. I just appreciate it differently now.
Yeah, that's lovely. That's a lovely entry point for you to come in. Luke, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, my history with Contact actually does begin with the novel. I read the novel before I saw the film. I was kind of like 18, 19 at the time. I was really into science fiction books, particularly into hard sci-fi, which is an element of science fiction which is grounded in much more reality. It's very technical, has a lot of science in it. Usually written by authors who were scientists or had a science background. You've got David Brin, who wrote The Postman, Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, even Andy Weir, who wrote The Martian, had a background in computer science. So, yeah, Contact came at a time when I was very, very into science. So, and having Carl Sagan, the famous man who wrote Cosmos and Demon Haunted World, having him come with a sci-fi novel was like, yes. So yeah, that was my first experience. And then when I think I was 19 when the film came out, kind of similar to Ian, I'd lost my dad a year before, so I came into the film watching Contact. It certainly had a strong emotional impact on me, as well as that theme of science and the kind of fight between science and religion. That element of loss and grief was definitely resonated with me very heavily at that time, and kind of has through every single rewatch, basically.
Sure.
So yeah, that film definitely has. It's a very film close to my heart.
Isn't that interesting though, that two people who lost a parent, you know, at a certain age, really feel a kinship with this. I haven't gone through that experience, but at the time this came out, my parents were in the middle of a fairly acrimonious divorce. So I was around 15 at this point. So it was 14, 15. So it was again a crucial sort of formative film for me. And there are other reasons I think why I fell in love with Contact. But now I think back about it, it could be that feeling of separation with parents that makes you, because it's obviously a film about the character of Elliott, Dr. Ellie Arroway, played by Jodie Foster, who loses her father when she's 9 years old, and that drives her, in terms of the movie at least, it drives her into this career looking for extraterrestrial life. But it's very much a film, amongst other things, about looking inward and for her resolving that loss of her father. So I think anyone who's gone through that will find Contact, I think, especially touching, really, because it's done. I don't know whether you guys would agree, but it's done in such a way that it's never too sentimental and saccharine. You know, it's always I think on the right side of that, really, and I think very quickly it draws you into Ellie's characterization. I think partly through what Jodie Foster does. I think she's fantastic in this film.
Yeah.
So I think it really immediately sort of grabs you in that way, doesn't it? In that touching way.
Yeah, I mean, even my partner Mel, who hasn't lost a parent, she dreads watching it because she's in absolute pieces by the end. So it has a resonance with her for a different reason, I think. But it's one of those films that I think definitely hits people in different ways depending on their circumstances in life, I think.
Obviously, though, this comes out as well, particularly at a time when alien movies about aliens, movies about extraterrestrials, the zeitgeist is very much about alien contact, alien abduction, UFOs. It is the 90s writ large, and there was a real obsession in cinema and television about this subject. You know, for everything from top down, from the X-Files to Independence Day to things like The Arrival with Charlie Sheen,
right.
if you remember that film.
Yeah.
The Roswell movie, the dramatization, just Men in Black, just so many films that seem to touch on this subject in the 90s. A real wave of this, and I'm sure it's the same for you guys. And I know, particularly for you, Luke, as a big X-Files fan like myself, you would have felt that. But it was everywhere, wasn't it? This kind of stuff back then.
It was rife in cinema and TV. And what I really like about Contact in like the context of all these alien films. I mean, this came a year after Independence Day. It came out the same year as Men in Black. And what I really like about Contact is that it's probably the most perfect antithesis of what all the other alien movies were doing at the time, which was alien invasion, military might, Will Smith, who was just everywhere at this time in science fiction. So Contact was almost like an antidote for that, and that it was a statement saying, well, actually, if we did contact aliens, here's actually a more measured way that we can see how the human race might respond to it. And you still got that representation of kind of like American paranoia and military might, all kind of encapsulated in the James Wood character. But you've also got just all those different views of it, and I think Contact came at a really good time in that it kind of stood out from the crowd in that way, that it wasn't a kind of studio big blockbuster, Will Smith saves the day, punching aliens in the face kind of movie. So it was a really nice antidote, I think, to that at the time.
Absolutely. Yeah. And to piggyback onto what you were saying, Luke, I think that for me, one of the things that always set it apart was like how thoughtful and cerebral and talky this movie is compared to a lot of what was coming out. Like, it's not that some of these other blockbuster movies that were coming out at the time like didn't have anything on their minds, but they aren't all like 2.5 hours long with characters debating big questions about the universe across multiple scenes. Like, that's just not something any of these other movies are doing. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, every movie is going to be its own thing with its own purposes. But well, I think, and Luke, we can maybe talk later about like some of the changes from the book. Like, it's definitely not as like in-depth and thoughtful about exploring some of these big questions as they can be in the text of a novel, but it still has a lot more to say than your average alien blockbuster that was coming out at this time.
Yeah. And I think one of the main things, for me, I think one of the main factors in that is the fact that when Zemeckis took the directorial role, he was given full artistic control and final cut privilege. Personally, I think that's a huge factor in how this film turns out the way it is at 2.5 hours. As you said, there's long scenes of debates and talking. And I think if there'd been some studio meddling, maybe it would have turned out a bit differently. Maybe it would have been a shorter film. So I think that definitely is a factor in it.
Tell us a bit about the book then, Luke, if you've read this. I don't know if you have, Ian. I haven't, but I do understand that it is much bigger in terms of a lot of the ideas that it covers, many more characters, takes place over a much greater span of time from what I know. So how differently does the film adapt this to the actual source material?
Apart from what you said, there is the time scale factor, which is it's definitely shortened down in the film, and I think you have to do that just in terms of logistics of doing a film of a book. But the book does it goes over a much longer time span. What's interesting about the book is it was actually conceived as a film script in 1979 by Carl Sagan, and that didn't really get off the ground. So then he kind of changed it into the novel form in 85. So, and the fact that Sagan and Andrewen had a lot of influence on this film. I mean, he died during production, I think, didn't he, Carl Sagan?
He did.
He had a rare form of cancer, which I can't remember the name of it at the minute. But he did have a lot of say in the scripts, and they ran a lot of things by him, like the shrunken time scale. They run that by Carl Sagan. He's like, yeah, that's fine. Let's go ahead with that. So even though there are little differences, I think the character work is bang on with the book, and I think the essence and the spirit and the message and the themes of the book are in the film as well. So for me, it's one of those near perfect adaptions of a book.
Those messages, I guess, really are. It's very much a film about the balance between science and faith, and this is something that definitely the X-Files was playing with at the time, and would go on to play with as it got towards the millennium as well. The idea of whether you can reconcile faith and science in the same bracket. But also this conceptual idea that was lurking under a lot of this fiction of aliens as God in some sense, or aliens as this cosmic figure that is equivalent to something that you would believe in, something you would have faith in. And that, I suppose, is something, I think that's something that edges more towards the end of this decade and maybe into the noughties then. Whereas I think a big chunk of the 90s is sort of recapturing that B-movie, like you say, aliens invading blockbuster sensibility, taking a lot of those 50s B-movie kind of concepts and giving them huge budgets like Independence Day, blowing up the White House, Mars Attacks with the aliens, and I love that film. Don't get me wrong, but it's very different.
Yeah.
So yeah, and giving it a much more slicker vibe, whereas Contact is getting into these huge ontological questions of whether or not you can equivalent the two, whether or not you can believe, you can have faith, and you can have scientific rigor at the same time. And I think had it been a poorer script, or had it been directed in a poorer way, I think you would have found the conversations that Ellie and Palmer Joss, played by Matthew McConaughey, have quite excruciating. But actually, the film pulls it off, even though they get into, I think at one point Palmer says, let's talk about Einstein. It's like, okay, fine. But he's so charming and he's so well written and he performs it so well that you kind of get sucked in, and they still keep it personal. I think that's the key. The film never gets away from keeping it to a very personal story for Ellie, even when they're talking about these huge conceptual ideas and actually having characters talk about it, which I find really refreshing. And it, like you say, Luke, it is a counterpoint to all of the, what does Will Smith say?
Welcome to Earth.
Welcome to Earth.
Yeah, welcome to Earth. That's what I call a close encounter. That kind of thing. Yeah, it's very different.
Yeah, and to Luke's point about the changes from the book, like I do think it is a good adaptation in the sense that Zemeckis recognized that this is a movie and that it needs to be constructed a little bit differently, and they do some things to Hollywood it up a bit from the book, which I think fans can kind of take or leave. Like the romance aspect is played up much more in the movie, of course. It's much more singularly focused on Ellie. Like in the book, there's a group of scientists that goes at the end, as opposed to it just being her. And I think that was a smart change, for example. I think that like distilling it into the essence of this is about her journey. She also faces a lot more, like at least a lot more explicit from what I remember. I read the book like 15 years ago. It's not fresh in my mind, but I don't remember as much explicit sexism and mansplaining and obstructionism that Ellie had to face in this movie. And I think it makes for great dramatic stakes in the movie. It gives her a lot to work against. But I don't remember that being as much of a forefronted element in the book, for example. I remember the ending being, that conversation being a lot longer, involving more math, reasons why it had to be distilled down into this more personal conversation and connection with her. She also, like, spoilers for the book, she does know at the end of the book what happens to her. She's not left, kind of wrestling with it, like having to find some sort of faith that she believes that what happened to her was real. She comes away knowing that it was, which I think is an important difference. That's probably the one change I wouldn't have made, but there are some important differences, but I think it's to agree with Luke, I think it's a good adaptation.
I find that change interesting, though. Actually, I think because it never feels necessarily like it's ambiguous in a way, because I never doubt that she experienced that. I mean, I know
no, but
you've got,
she
like,
does.
kits
like she's left
she
in
does.
the movie doubting, and I think that under like. I agree. For an audience, it is an interesting thing to wrestle with. It's that you get that ending moment of where the audience goes, oh, we know it actually happened, and that's a great moment for the audience. It is. I am left feeling like and again, I think it's in keeping with like the movie chose to front load this whole like faith versus reason kind of discussion, which the book didn't front load as much. So I think that in keeping with the themes of the movie, I get why they made that ending decision, because she is finding a form of faith as a result. But in the book, like that's she gets the reward at the end. You know what I mean? Like she gets to actually know. She doesn't have to decide to believe what she experienced. She actually gets to know what she experienced and know that it was real. And I think that for her as a character, like maybe it's just me being sentimental, I felt like she deserved that after all the shit she went through.
Yeah, the language that she uses throughout the film, the only time she ever prefaces a sentence with "I believe" is in that room talking to the Senate right at the end. I believe this happened, and it's like you said, Ian. It's the first time she's ever having to have faith in something when she's been fighting with Palmer. The whole thing. I only listen to fact and reason. That's my mantra of life. That's how I go about life. I choose fact and reason over belief. And sitting in this room. And when you've got James Woods' character going, as a scientist, if you were sat here in my place as a scientist, would you not believe the story that you're saying? And she says, yes, as a scientist, I have to say there is no empirical evidence that I experience what I experience. But I can't refute the belief that happened. So I think that's and that whole bit is thematically linked to the conversation earlier between Palmer and Ellie when Palmer basically said, "Do you love your father?" And she says, "Well, of course I do. Prove it." So there's this big thing that goes through the whole movie, and it's those two conversations are linked. And at the end, it's Ellie is for the first time in her life believing something happened rather than having the facts presented to her that something happened.
This really is the closest I think Jodie Foster does ever come to playing Dana Scully in the X-Files, because like you've got this film is exploring so many of the similar kind of overlapping ideas. I mean, there was the big back in the 90s, there was the big question mark throughout the early part of the 90s that if they made an X-Files movie, which obviously they eventually do a year after this, that they might get Richard Gere and Jodie Foster to play Mulder and Scully at the time when David Duchovny and Gillian Anderson weren't famous, and that was what a lot of like press were speculating on, and obviously that never happened. Jodie Foster does appear in the X-Files, let it be known, the same year actually, in voice form anyway, as an evil tattoo. That's a whole different story.
That's funny.
It's not actually. Oh yeah. An evil tattoo called Betty. Yeah, brilliant. She's very good in it as well. But my point is that this period really feels like, you see it in televised Star Trek as well, and things like Babylon 5 and a lot of the Outer Limits. It feels like a really key time, the mid to late 90s, where science fiction in television and cinema was huge, and it was everywhere, but it was also a point where a lot of these questions were being asked, and a lot of TV shows were exploring these big cosmic ideas, but ones that had very core personal conceptual roots. And I think Contact is the biggest Hollywood expression of that, really.
Yes.
And in a way that I don't think that you would ever get made now in quite the same way, and not just because of the fact that certain things in this might feel a bit dated. I think Ellie might not be quite as love-struck by Palmer in this day and age, even if it is Matthew McConaughey, who is just ridiculously good-looking for this guy. I think there's certain things in there, that would change. Sorry, Ian, go on.
Oh, no, I agree. I think there's definitely things that would change, but I think the common theme, going back to like discussing how this movie got made and why, like, Robert Zemeckis was coming off of like the hottest hand he could possibly be coming off of. Like, he had an absolute blank check to do whatever he wanted. And, he basically looked at this script that had been kicking around in one form or another since the 70s and was like, look, if I'm not going to make it now, it may never get made. And that's how it got made. And similarly, like, I think the most recent movie I can think of that sort of played in these waters kind of thematic, like philosophically and intellectually, is a movie like Arrival, which I loved as well. And that was, again,
true.
Like, Denis Villeneuve had a kind of a blank check to say, like, well, I can make this like on a budget. Like, he had a he maximized the budget he was given for that. But essentially, like, if he or someone of his stature hadn't decided that movie was going to get made, that movie would never have gotten made. So it does to some extent come down to there being like the right people in the right place at the right time with the right money and resources at their disposal in order for these projects to get made in the first place, regardless of when they get made.
Let's use that as a jumping off point then to take a quick break, and we'll come back and we'll maybe talk a little bit more about Zemeckis, a little bit more about the cast, production, etc., things like that, because there's a fair bit more with Contact to discuss. So stay with us, guys, and we'll be back after these short messages.
Welcome to the third age of podcasting.
The year is 2023.
The name of the podcast
is A Dream Given Form.
Join us for the 30th anniversary of Babylon 5 as we move to fortnightly episodes looking back at The Gathering, the pilot episode of Babylon 5, Season 1 and beyond, with a plethora of guests to join us too.
The Gathering is actually 1 week where we critique. There's some good stuff in there, but we can absolutely critique too, I think.
I completely agree, definitely. I liken The Gathering and the first episode. I kind of compare them to the X-Files pilot and Deep Throat. I wouldn't say hate, but it's a very, very strong
Yeah.
dislike of the cycle.
Yeah, well, I feel like the cycle ruined one of his childhood. So,
Yeah.
you know,
Essentially.
And also,
Fair enough, man.
as well, there were levels. There's Talia representing the psychotic that destroyed her mother, and then there's Bester and Bester and Kelsey, you know, who are just psychopaths, and you know they are the personification of everything that she hates.
And be sure to check out all our content from the last year of A Dream Given Form, including thematic lookbacks at the show.
And today we're going to be discussing the 3 prominent leaders of Babylon 5. Sinclair, Sheridan, and Delenn.
We thought we would combine our 2 greatest loves, because it's not just Babylon 5, it's Lord of the Rings too, because there's a lot of Lord of the Rings influences that JMS drew upon developing Babylon 5, and even interviews with some of the stars of Babylon 5 itself.
He said, I'll tell you what. He said, what would you like to do if you had a character? I said, first of all, I don't want to carry a ray gun. I don't want to carry a blaster or a transporter thing and beam me up, Scotty. I want to be different than everybody you have on here. And I want to carry a sword because that is what he lives by. That's part of his thing, his warrior mentality.
I love hearing that people are still interested in Babylon 5. And, you know, it's really an honor to continue the conversation around a show that meant so much to us. And, you know, it was the little show that could.
So check out A Dream Given Form, a Babylon 5 podcast on the We Made This network.
The last
Best hope
for peace.
Welcome back, guys, to At the Movies in the 90s, where we're talking about Contact, Robert Zemeckis' 1997 science fiction epic. I'm Tony, they are Ian and Luke, and they sound so conceptual. They, my guests are Ian and Luke, and so Robert Zemeckis. We were talking about him just before the break. He, like you say, he's got a blank check to do this. He's obviously, by this point, already a huge directorial figure. He's somebody who has come out of... His previous film to this was Forrest Gump, which is a huge success. Critically, I think commercially that did very well as well. It was up for... I think it might have won Oscars, actually. I think it won.
It sure did. It did over Pulp Fiction. It sure did.
That's right. Yeah. Which, you know, a lot of people had their issues with. But obviously, before that, he's done some of the biggest films, you know, in Hollywood history. The Back to the Future trilogy, Death Becomes Her, Who Framed Roger Rabbit. So this guy's been around since the 70s, comes out of the end of that 70s American New Wave stable with people like Spielberg, George Lucas, etc. And he makes films that are very populist and blockbustery. And I feel like Contact is probably the last film that he makes, I would say, that's truly... You could maybe argue Castaway with Tom Cruise is as big, but I think Contact is his last truly great movie, I think. What do you guys think?
I agree.
Yeah, totally
I love
agree.
Castaway, but I don't have the same on a personal level. Like I you know, someone who knows a little bit more film, you know, about film and film theory than all of us, like, might be able to debate. Well, like, Castaway is a more efficiently constructed, blah 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 blah, blah whatever. I like Castaway a lot, but this is the one for me that feels like his last. You know, we'll get into whether we consider this a classic, but for me personally, spoiler alert, it's a classic, and I don't feel that way about Castaway.
Yeah, I fall into the same camp completely. I do like Castaway as a film; it's good fun, but yeah, because you know, Contact falls into so many of my ballparks. In terms of themes and what the film consists of, for me it is a classic as well. It's a classic 90s movie, which just it's you know, it's an intellectual movie, which I know that can be seen as quite aloof, but that's why I like it, because it's a cerebral blockbuster rather than a Will Smith blockbuster. Not to, you know, degrade Will Smith blockbusters, but you know what I mean. In the context of this movie,
yeah,
there is room for both. Absolutely.
It's great counter programming at the box office.
Absolutely, yeah.
And superbly directed, I would say, in many ways. You know, I mean, I know you guys. We were talking before we recorded about the infamous mirror shot of young Ellie running in her house when her dad's died, and she's running, and it becomes this almost optical illusion of the mirror pulls out, and I can't describe it brilliantly well, but there's a great description of it on the DVD release and the Blu-ray releases, where they talk about the blue screen they used as part of the construction of that. I mean, that's amazing. That's got to be one of the best shots in the movie, but I would argue one of the best shots of the 90s, actually.
Yeah, I would completely agree. It is iconic, and even though I know the explanation of it, I've read about the explanation, watched it on DVD, I still watch it and go, nah, don't know how they did it. It's such a
so clever.
It's magical. It's a magical shot, and I don't. It's so well done. And the thing with Zemeckis, particularly in this film, is that he's not. Like, apart from a few amazing sequences, he's not too flashy. He's not too, there's a lot of what he does, and he does in a very, very expert way, is that because you've got a lot of characters stood or sat around talking, the film has to still be dynamic. It still has to have propulsion. And his direction and the way he moves around it. For instance, the scene where Ellie first hears the signal, and she's on the walkie-talkie, and the guys are running around the office trying to get everything ready. That is essentially a system maintenance check and testing the signals. That's a boring thing to do, but he makes it such an exciting and dynamic scene, even though what they're actually doing in real life is just routine checks. And that's for me why he's so great directing this film. And then he comes out with shots like the mirror shot. He does he plays around with optics a lot. There's either shots coming out of irises, like the beginning where you get the pan out of the universe, and then
that's
out
amazing.
And then out of Ellie's eyes.
Yeah,
it's incredible. And there's a lot of watching action, characters watching action through screens. There's a hell of a lot of that, and his play with optics, whether it be the human eye or through screen, really plays heavily along through the film.
Yeah, a lot of clever visual trickery that Zemeckis has always excelled at. I mean, you look at a lot of his movies, like Who Framed Roger Rabbit, those effects still hold up. You still watch that movie and go, I still don't know how they did this, especially back then. Like, this is pretty seamless. I don't get it. I just wrapping my head around that. And, coming off of the Back to the Future films and even Forrest Gump, like there's a lot of it's lower key, but like all of the trickery involved in getting Forrest to interact with these historical figures and all this reconstructed like fake footage back in the 90s, like before deep fakes were a glimmer in anyone's eye. Zemeckis figured out how to do this and do it well. And we see some of those same tricks employed here, again in a kind of lower key way. He was also a good selection for who to direct this movie.
Well, we see it, don't we, with Bill Clinton in this particularly, where they insert. And the great thing was, and he's talked about how amazing it was that they found a speech that Clinton did
about the Mars rock
before this.
About
the Mars rock. The Mars rock that crashed in Antarctica in 1984, and then he comes into the public consciousness and then features in an episode of the X-Files around this point, and that gets tethered to like the Tunguska experiments and things like this. So all these things were circling around in science fiction. But yeah, they take the line where he says we are monitoring the situation or something like that, and they were like, oh, this is gold. And they and then they do also port in, I think it's a speech he gives about Saddam Hussein and the Iraq conflict that he's kind of out of context. And I believe there were people in the White House who complained about the use of that footage. But like whenever I was reading that, I was thinking, oh, come on, guys, it's a movie about an alien contact.
Well, apparently they'd run the script by the White House, and they said, yeah, that's fine, and everything. And then when the movie came out, I think it was White House counsel Charles Ruff basically wrote a letter to Warner Brothers going, this is an inappropriate use of the president. We were like, well, we run it by you.
Right.
You guys gave us the go-ahead, so we did it.
But yeah, like you say, it's a very good use of trickery. It works quite well in the context of this, really. And so I think there are lots of elements in this that Zemeckis doesn't overplay it, but he he allows the drama to function. He allows for the climactic set piece with Ellie going through the wormhole, etc. I mean, that to have a real sense of momentum without it being too over the top. Like, he vetoed an original script ending where the aliens come down like angels. He's like, well, we can't do that. That's too over the top in this case. So he goes for, I think the spectacle is the journey she undertakes, and I think that is so well done, and the build up to it with her in the machine going, I'm good to go, and he escalates and builds and then also we have to say Alan Silvestri's score is magnificent in this film.
Yeah.
And it does some of the heavy lifting at points, actually, I would say, without the music, especially at moments like that, ramping things up, or even the more tender moments, as well. I think that music is so brilliantly executed in terms of this film. So you put all these elements together, an amazing production design. That pod at the end, the design of that is so good. You put it all together and you end up with a film that has both a personal element and spectacle at the same time. And he's really good here, I think, at pulling that off.
Yeah. What I like about Zemeckis and Silvestri's relationship is that, yes, the music does a lot of heavy lifting at certain points, but they both also know when to have no music at all and just have those silent play. And I love the understated use of that. And that, like, mixed with these amazing wide shots of the very large array. For instance, there's a shot of Ellie basically sat on the hood of her car, and you've just got the vast array behind her. If they hadn't had the chance to shoot that on location and had to like put a matte painting or something, it would have never have had the kind of awesomeness that it has on screen.
And one of the things that I think Zemeckis does really well as a director is finding that emotional core to these otherwise very kind of, not broad, but they're very big stories. They've got a lot of going on. There's a lot of plot, or there's like a lot of heavy themes, whatever the case may be. He's always able to find a really solid emotional core for audiences to latch onto and care about, despite all the, like, regardless of all the craziness going on around the characters. Like, you look at Back to the Future and that core relationship between Doc and Marty. You look at even a film like a film like this one, where you have that relationship between Ellie and her father, and to I think a much lesser extent in terms of its importance, the relationship between her and Palmer, but also movies like going back to Jewel of the Nile and Romancing the Stone, like that core relationship between Michael Douglas and Kathleen Turner that gets everyone invested in those movies, like Who Framed Roger Rabbit, like Eddie Valiant's trauma about the loss of his brother and learning to accept that and process that, like that's at the heart of that movie. And so I think that he does a really good job as a director at finding those emotional beats, to use a term that Ashley Thomas, our fellow podcaster, likes to use, to hit with audiences.
And I think, for me personally anyway, probably not for everyone, but for me, I think that's what a lot of the contemporary directors today who do action blockbusters, they can't find that balance of heart and action. And a lot of these action films can seem hollow. There's no central there's no central emotional core to the films. And I think what Zemeckis and a lot of the older directors from the 90s and the 80s can do is inject that and make sure that there's a central relationship or relationships that have that emotional resonance, as well as having all the kinetic actions surrounding it and all the different plot ideas and stuff. And I do think that is missing from a large section of action blockbuster films these days.
Yeah. So you would, like I said, you wouldn't really get Contact made in this way as a movie, I don't think. Now, if you did, it would be smaller scale, or it would be. I think, like you said, Ian. I think Arrival by Denis Villeneuve is a modern example of something very similar, definitely. Yeah. But even that is now nearly 10 years old, so who knows? But yeah, I mean, let's talk a little bit about the cast then, because we mentioned Jodie Foster at the beginning, but she would, after maybe Silence of the Lambs, is this her best performance? This has to be one of her best performances, right?
Yes, she's so good. She's so captivating in this movie. I mean, if this performance doesn't work, this movie doesn't work. Obviously, maybe that's being a little too obvious, but it's so crucial to how well this movie works.
Yeah, she's amazing. She reminds me a lot of the actress Mira Furlan in that she really, every time she's on screen, she puts her heart and soul out there on screen. And even though Ellie as a character is a reasonable scientific person, the emotion that she gets through the character out on screen is incredible. She really puts forward that frustration and that drive that she has to do the work she wants to do. She's constantly told by Drumlin, who I hate with every fibre of my body, constantly told by him, you are doing the wrong thing, you're in the wrong job. It's, like Ian said, mansplaining earlier on. And the whole aspect of sexism in science is encapsulated so perfectly and so horribly in Drumlin. And also, there's a long history of brilliant female scientists being kind of pushed to the background and the male getting the Nobel Prize or the male getting his name on the paper, when in fact these amazing women were vital to the whole process. And Ellie is constantly trying to be is constantly being pushed out and ostracized from her project, mainly by Drumlin, who is the representation of sexism in science. And she gets that across so well in every scene that he basically cuts her off, which it makes me angry just thinking about it, because it's and it's only really affected me this last rewatch, because I've not watched this film in about 10 years. So and just the column, the Me Too thing, and me kind of being around science circles and knowing how the struggles that women have had in science, particularly from the 40s to the 70s. Things have been a bit better in the 80s, much better in the 90s, and we're getting there in these days now. So I think that's a great factor, and I think Jodie Foster in her performance really gets that across as well. That frustration and that drive, and also that kind of fuck you attitude. I'm just going to do it anyway because that's what I want to do. So I love it. She's brilliant.
Matthew McConaughey, then, I mean, like I said earlier, he's. I feel like he shouldn't pull this off, like, because he's really cheesy. He's really he's the most handsome sort of priest, sort of not priest ever. I mean, I had to laugh when he went, I couldn't handle the celibacy thing. And he's making
too horny to be a priest.
He is the horniest priest.
Sorry, everyone. I like fucking too much to be a priest. I can't do it to you all. I just can't do it. I can't take myself off the market. I owe it to you all.
It's so funny. And I mean, credit though, those two have real chemistry, I think, all through the film. They do. Actually. And I mean, but mind you, I mean, I'd fancy Jodie Foster if I was him as well, to be honest. She is gorgeous all the way through this film. But he shouldn't work as a character, because he is essentially there to provide the faith-based side of the argument. And he'll just pop up every now and then, whether he's turning up at the White House, and then he's here, there, but he's good. He's really good. And this was just before he fell into that 10-year period where all he made were shit rom-coms. And then you get the reconnaissance, as they called it, in the 2010s. But I feel like he should have just kept doing stuff more like this, because he is a really good screen presence. I always really enjoy him in this film.
It's a big surprise, actually, because previously to this he'd done A Time to Kill, where again he's brilliant, and it's a proper dramatic role, a dramatic performance. So he'd done that, and then he did this. I think his performance in A Time to Kill probably had a lot to bear on the decision to cast him in this role. Because I mean, before that he'd just been doing odd films here and there. I mean, his first role that I ever saw him in was in Dazed and Confused, where the orad comes from, which we'll never get away from. But yeah, he'd done A Time to Kill. He did this, 2 good dramatic performances, and then, like you said, he just fell into this rom-com pit for 10 years. So it is an odd career trajectory for him. But he's great in this. Like you said, he's a bit ridiculously handsome, with some very impressive hair well.
Hair's very good.
I like his first half of the movie hair better than the last half of the movie hair, but yeah, he's got a good hair game.
The first half hair is almost like surfer dude hair, isn't it?
Yeah, it's that very kind of like windswept, sun-kissed kind of like he just like wandered off the beach and is gonna like drop some profound knowledge on you and then wander off into the night.
He is in Puerto Rico, so maybe that's why.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I think I'm a little less high on his performance than you guys. I think he's good. I think he's maybe coasting a little bit on a lot of his natural charm and charisma, which he possesses in spades. I think though my biggest problems with this character are just with the character and his actions and some of the things he says and does in the movie, and less about McConaughey's performance. But I think for me, he's of the main cast probably my least favorite, but I think he's good. I think my problems are with the character.
Go into that a bit more, Ian. I'm curious. What problems do you have with Palmer?
So I think there is... We haven't yet gotten to the 90s tropes yet, but I'll spoil my opinions on that front a little bit. This movie is not male gazy per se. In fact, I think it does a lot to highlight the struggles that women in STEM are going through. Still, I think it is unfortunately, tragically, still very, very relevant on that front.
Particularly in academia, definitely.
But one thing that did feel a little 90s to me, especially on this watch, looking at it from a 2023 lens, is, Ellie, and by extension the audience, are expected to like easily swallow McConaughey's confession at the very end that he sabotaged her career and life's work because he caught feelings for her after they slept together once 5 years ago and she never called him again. Like, that to me is a leap that they would only take in a 90s movie and not one that I would take in 2023. Again, like, I'm looking at it and I'm like, this is that's the way this feels like a 90s movie in a not the best way, is this kind of acceptance that he just sort of like, after they had a fling once 5 years ago, he caught some feelings and decided to potentially irrevocably blow up her career and her life's work. And she just kind of was like, oh, that's sweet.
Yeah.
I mean, and also there's a 4-year gap between that fling and the events towards the back end of the film,
during which they had zero contact, none whatsoever. That to me is like, oh, if the character hadn't done that, like, I would feel more, I think, like you guys do, where like, oh, this is like a good relationship that shouldn't work on paper, but it somehow does because of their natural charisma and chemistry. But like, he does something that I think is like pretty close to unforgivable.
Well, I don't know if I'd say that it's the relationship that I like about the dynamic between them as much as the way they get into all of the bigger subjects. I think that's more what it is for me.
That all works. That all definitely, I think those scenes definitely work. And you're right. Those are challenging scenes to have come across in a way that isn't eye-rolling. And the fact that they both manage it is part of the magic of this movie.
I think that's exactly the best description of it. Absolutely, definitely. The magic of the movie draws you in. It makes you interested in these topics because of the way they present them as characters. But I can't deny what you're saying there. That's a really good take on that, and I think it is very much that 90s lens, in terms of this. So I definitely see where you're coming from, 100%.
And I do think that the very brief, truncated fling that they have at the beginning, I do think that the condension of the timeline that the film has to do makes that relationship suffer, because literally within 10 minutes they're in bed together. Of adult Jodie Foster being on screen, and I think that does have a lot to do with the condension of how they're having to make the timeline smaller, and I think Ian is right in the way, that it seems like a little fling in the film, and then he's deeply in love with her 4 years later.
It does. I'm sorry to interrupt, but like watching the scene again, it really struck me like when she's leaving the next morning, it very, very clearly, in a way that like it definitely didn't read to me as a kid. I didn't pick up on this, but like as an adult watching this movie, she's very clearly giving him the brush off. She's like, leave your number. I'll call you. Sure. You just let yourself out. Like she just had a one night stand with this dude because he's super hot. They're in Puerto Rico. Like why the hell not? And like she didn't give him that much more thought. Like I think that when he's reintroduced to the story, we're meant to take that like, oh, like maybe he has been on her mind a little bit more than we let on, but like he clearly made an impression, and she now had, but it just felt like a lot of weight being put on a very, very small, narrow foundation.
She did open up to him though, a little more than she probably has done with anyone about her dad. And then when she realizes she's done that, that's the point where she puts the clothes back on. She's like, "Yeah, go, fine, you stay here." Yep. She shuts down straight away.
That's a good point. That's a great point.
As soon as the topic of of her father comes up, that's when she shuts down. And she's
exactly.
Like, I'm done now.
She can't. Yeah. So there is that. But no, I get you. You're right, Ian. You're right. The only way I can square it is that I think I'd probably fall in love with Jodie Foster after one night with her at that point. So but no, I get where you're coming from.
You need a charismatic, handsome actor like Matthew McConaughey, because the character of Palmer Joss is essentially a mouthpiece for the argument that God is real. And he's literally just a mouthpiece for that argument. And you need someone like Matthew McConaughey to kind of just, to make him a three-dimensional character, really, and make him this suave man of the cloth, but without the cloth. I don't want to stop fucking women. Priest.
Suave, horny man, basically.
That's suave, horny man. Yeah.
What about the surrounding cast then around them? I mean, it's a heck of a supporting cast,
great,
isn't it? It's one of those great 90s. You've got people like, I'm not a big fan of him now, but James Woods, who is a good actor despite everything else. Angela Bassett, who whenever she can just come into any movie and she might be there for 5 minutes and she's just brilliant in every single film.
William Fichtner.
William Fichtner, he's great. He's so nice in this film. Like
there's a slightly sick joke in the fact that he plays a blind man. They've called him Kent Clark, which if you spin it round, I'm sure someone's playing a little bit of a sick joke there, but but he's great in that. He's great in that film.
He is. David Morse, who's really good as her dad in the small scenes he has. He breaks your heart basically in that performance. Just loads of good. Tom Skerritt, who is like you say, Luke, he's playing an awful character in Drumlin, who is a really mercurial, example of that male-dominated, I'll take all the credit kind of world.
Plays him
God, Drumlin fucking
and he plays
sucks.
him really well.
Every time I watch this
awful.
movie,
I'm
like surprised by like how much visceral hatred I have for that man.
I hate him with every fiber of my body.
He's a real bastard.
He's the worst.
Absolutely.
And we get John,
and he's so smart.
And we get John Hurt too. Also from Alien. Always
so good.
Want to take a ride?
Yeah, he's brilliant.
As his face, his creepy old man cancer face fills the screen.
I love it.
You want to take a ride?
You want to take a ride? He's so great because he's basically playing I suppose at the time, what would be the equivalent? Sort of a Bill Gates kind of figure, I guess. This was before the rise of the tech bro billionaire.
Yeah, he's more reminiscent of, oh my God, Amazon. Blanking on his name.
Oh, Bezos.
Bezos.
Yeah.
Oh,
Bezos.
I know it's
Jeff
the bald.
Bezos.
I know it's the bald thing. That's why it's a shallow comparison. But that's now that I see him, I'm like, oh God, he's like a space Bezos. It's just
he's like a space Bezos. Yeah, or I think you could have slotted this guy quite nicely into the Syndicate in the X-Files.
Oh yeah,
have him be one of those mysterious, guys controlling everything. But he's very. I mean, he's only got a couple of scenes, John Hurt, but he's great. He's one of those characters who pops up, and he's obviously really important to the plot because basically, I think without him, the plot wouldn't go anywhere because he keeps coming to Elliott going, here's a bit more information. Here's something you didn't know. So without that, I think she'd be buggered.
Yeah, he's a bit of the Deus Ex Machina of the story.
He is absolutely a Deus Ex Machina.
By the way, we built another $3 trillion machine for you.
There is a bit of that. But he is very good. So yeah, superb supporting cast here of people. Even people in small roles like Tucker Smallwood, the great Tucker Smallwood, as the guy in the machine HQ doing all that.
Yeah,
stuff.
Jake Busey as the mental terrorist.
God, Jake Busey.
Thing. With that hair.
Yeah, I mean he's here a bit of a cliche. The sort of psychotic, super, Christian zealots, blonde heads, terrorists. I mean, he feels like a very 90s American terrorist, doesn't he? Before it all, the impression of terrorism changed,
I think the dialogue that they give him, what limited lines they give him, that comes across as a bit generic and cliche. I kind of, on this watch, I was wishing that they had done something a little bit more specific and made some different choices with his dialogue. It does come across as kind of pat, bland, religious fanatic nonsense. But I will say, as a screen presence, very striking. And almost to the point where you have to wonder, like, how did he get up there in the first place? Who looked at this man and thought, yeah, he belongs here?
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's major
very
security
90s.
failings.
That's very 90s. That is definitely.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, they just wouldn't happen these days. But no,
and I love sorry, Tony, and I love the fact that when Jodie Foster's kind of noticing him, he turns and looks directly into the camera to go, "I'm the bad guy," and then walks away out of shot, doesn't he?
Creepy look he gives the camera as he's turning. It's just like, ugh, God, this guy's obviously about to kill everyone.
Yeah. Superb supporting cast then, generally, around the main player. So it's got that really in its favour. Let's talk then, before we move on to the trope, we're going to talk about 90s tropes. I'll explain a bit more about that in a second. But let's talk about the reaction then, the sort of the legacy of it. So the box office was worldwide total of 171 million. And this was on a budget of 90 million, so it wasn't necessarily a monster hit, although that's not too bad for the purposes of the era, really.
No one lost money.
But it wasn't but it wasn't necessarily a monster hit at the time. Largely positive critical reviews, although the Rotten Tomatoes aggregate score is only 68%, so that seems a little low, but that's probably one of those reflections of that some people, I think, would have found the film a little bit either slow, or they might have found it a little bit too much pondering on the human condition and religion and faith, that when some people, I think some people might have just wanted more of that blockbuster entertainment. So I think that's probably where that divide comes from.
Yeah, it did okay financially, did make huge money, but it's probably made a lot more money on home video and streaming since. So I think it's safe to say it's profitable at this point. But yeah, you're right. The critical reaction was kind of mixed, although generally positive. Like Ebert was very high on it. It definitely had its champions, but yeah, it was not universally praised.
Although SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, which was a name that was just everywhere in this era as well, it was another one of those things.
Yeah,
they described it as indescribably more accurate in its depiction of SETI than any Hollywood film in history, and there might I imagine that's probably still accurate today. Actually, 5 years later,
sure.
I can't imagine that. I can't think of another film that has really tried to tackle the reality of contact with alien life. Yes, okay. There's a lot of stuff in this that is obviously science fiction. The machine, the vortex thing that she falls through, all of this, right? But still, the steps taken, that confluence between politics and religion and faith and science, the conversation about that, the fact that you don't end up with a big alien spacecraft land in that kind of that Spielbergian sense of science fiction wonder. You don't have any of that. So I think in that sense, it's probably, there's a lot in here, probably on a factual basis, in terms of the radio signal that they get, with that wonderful vroom, vroom, vroom sound. Which
Wonderful
is
sound.
all of that.
Yeah, it is, and it sounds like it sounds like an inverted TARDIS sound.
No, it does actually.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of the scientific accuracy had a lot to do with Carl Sagan being
right
around when he was allowed, but also they also had a lady called Jill Tarter, who was the head of the Project Phoenix for the SETI Institute. She was also hired as a consultant, so all that SETI stuff, she was probably quite adamant that this has to be this way and make it accurate. So I think
she was basically the inspiration for Ellie, I think, wasn't she?
Yeah, she was. Yeah,
and then Jodie Foster met her, I believe.
Yeah, she spent quite a bit of time with her as well. And Kip Thorne's wormhole study had a lot to do with the final sequences as well.
Well, interestingly, I kept thinking while watching this would make a great double bill with Interstellar, Christopher Nolan's Interstellar. And Kip Thorne heavily was involved in that as well, later, like 15 years, to nearly 15 odd years later. So I think Contact and then Interstellar is a heck of a double bill. I encourage anyone to have a go at that, because there are similarities between these two films in some ways, in terms of that emotional resonance within these conceptual ideas about, planet and aliens and planets and things. So Interstellar definitely feels like the next version of Contact. You know what I mean? For a different era. But yeah. So accuracy was great, and I think it's still very fondly remembered by a lot of people overall. So before we get on to the tropes, is there anything we've missed, guys? Anything you guys want to talk about Contact? Any particular things that you've got written down or anything?
I just want to do a shout out to the actor who did the worst Australian accent I've ever heard on film. That guy was definitely not Australian.
I don't even remember an Australian accent.
She's talking to him on the screen, isn't she?
Yeah.
About the signal.
Because Vega's about to go below the horizon where they are, so they're having to get in contact with Australia to keep tracking Vega.
Yeah.
And the actor, whoever he is, just does a diabolical Australian accent.
Yeah.
He sounds more British. I think he was a British actor, to be honest.
He sounds British until he says, alrighty.
right out.
Right out, yeah. Right out. Oh, you're Australian now, are you? Oh, okay.
Yeah. True. Very true. What about you, Ian? Any other notes on Contact?
Not really. Ellie was definitely like a cinematic hero of mine after this point. Definitely helped inform me on my already growing like skepticism of religion, but like definitely was like another nudge down that road at the age of 11. I've always loved sci-fi of any kind, and I've always been really tickled by this like the trope of the mysterious, powerful aliens like elevating humanity kind of thing. So I think this was maybe like one of my earliest like entrees into like that particular subgenre of science fiction, and like I've always loved it ever since. There's actually a book, since you guys are both book people, I want to recommend. I don't know if you guys have read or heard of The Sparrow by Mary Doria Russell.
I haven't.
It's a book that I can't recommend highly enough. It's pretty short, so it's a fairly quick read. It tells the story of a Jesuit priest, since we're on the topic of faith versus religion, of science versus religion, who is part of an ill-fated first contact mission. And it's this really moving and at times disturbing exploration of the challenges posed by first contact and communication with an alien species, a truly alien species, and like the misunderstandings and tragic misunderstandings that can arise from failures of communication, understandable failures of communication. And can't recommend the book highly enough. There's also a sequel, which is good, but The Sparrow by Mary Doria Russell is fantastic.
Okay, that is going on my list.
Yeah, I've just saved that on my Goodreads, so that's definitely on the list. Yeah, that's the
very good. Very good. Thank you for that, Ian. Yeah. Right, so let's talk about 90s tropes. So one of the things, regular things in this podcast is going to be, I've got 10 90s tropes from various different movies and 90s culture, etc., that I'm going to rattle through in each film. And these might well adapt, they might morph over time, there might be new additions, etc. But these are the 10 I've come up with. So, guys, let's pick through Contact and see where it fits on the 90s trope score. Let's begin with, is someone at any point wearing cool sunglasses?
Not that I
didn't
remember.
No, I didn't notice that anyone wearing sunglasses.
No.
No, I don't think I did either, and I was looking a lot.
Yeah.
But no.
Yeah.
We're in New Mexico.
No,
You'd
okay.
think there would be some sunglasses, but I didn't see any.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, strange. So, nothing there. Is there any alt rock or hip hop on the soundtrack?
Nope.
Imagine this film with a hip hop soundtrack. That's something to imagine.
Maybe
I
Ellie
think
likes to
there is some
blast
alt
some
rock.
Biggie while she is listening to the Cosmos.
I think I did hear some alt rock, or at least some rock, at the very beginning when you see Earth and you see the radio, you hear the radio signal.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I think that counts because it is
that's stretching it a bit, but okay.
It is. There was rock on Earth. So I'm gonna go with that. Is there a fat / nerdy / gay best friend for the handsome lead? I don't think there's anyone who's fat.
No.
I mean, technically, all of her friends are nerdy because of what she does.
Right.
So
yeah.
yes, technically,
Yeah.
I guess, but there's not in the '90s tropey way that you mean, though. Like, I do want to say that. Like,
Yeah.
it's not the kind of '90s tropey sense that you mean, but yeah, she's got. If you think of like the William Fichtner character, he's obviously a nerd.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess in that sense, yes.
Luke, would you agree? Is that a trope or not? Really, in this film?
I think so, but I take Ian's point. Yeah, basically they're all nerds. They're all scientists, so they're all kind of classed as nerds or geeks or whatever thing. So it's difficult to kind of say, is there a specific person? But yeah, I mean, William Fichtner's character's a nerd. The other guy that works for them, who smokes the pipe, is a nerd.
Yeah, I think we've got to give it a nerd point for this.
Yeah,
because
we'll give it a nerd point.
So many nerds.
There are quite
Too
a
many
few.
nerds to ignore.
There are a lot of nerds.
Yeah.
But you're right. It's not a cliched, silly trope in that sense. It is part of the story.
No, this movie doesn't have a lot of cliches.
No. Are there references to the 1960s at any point?
Yes, in that radio broadcast.
Yes.
Yep. Okay. Yeah.
And I think they
I
mention...
can't remember what they reference in there, but yeah.
Kennedy presidency and assassination.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Moon landing too.
And
gets
yeah,
mentioned.
I was going to say moon landing. They do talk about moon landing as well. Yeah.
Right. Okay. All right. That's a point then. Is there a goth? I don't think there's a goth.
That priest is the closest thing.
Yeah.
No, he's a cloth. He's a man of the cloth,
right.
not a man of the goth.
Get out. I'm firing you from your podcast. Get out.
Is there a token minority character?
I'm going to say yes, because I think William Fichtner character, because he's blind, I think fits into the minority category.
Could you also argue that Angela Bassett as being the only really prominent black character in there? Or, I don't know, because she's really good in it.
She's not a token.
She's clearly...
I'll never say Angela Bassett is playing a token character. I will say that I think her character might represent some of the tokenism going on in the 90s in politics.
Yeah.
But she as a character is definitely not that.
Okay. Is she meant? She's not, because I kept thinking, is she meant to represent wasn't it Condoleezza Rice, or she was after this?
Condi was after.
Wasn't she the Bush era?
The let's see, who would have been the person in the Clinton White House at the time? I'd have to think about it. I don't recall.
I don't know off the top of my head. No. So let's give the token point then to William Fichtner. I think that's a good point there. Okay, is someone wearing a leather jacket, preferably black?
Not that I can recollect.
I didn't see any leather in this.
Oh.
Okay, no leather jackets. I have to say, I loved the leather jacket back then, and very much in the noughties. That was very much a noughties trope as well. The leather jacket.
Oh, sure.
Absolutely, yeah. I definitely had a black leather jacket. Now, we got into this a little bit earlier. Does the film suffer from the male gaze? Yes or no?
Not in the way that basically a lot of 90s movies did. So I'll say that. It's much, much better about that than a lot of other 90s movies, and does a lot more than a lot of 90s blockbuster sci-fi movies were doing in highlighting the struggles that women were and still are facing in these fields and other fields.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Let's not put one for that then. Yeah, okay. Is there any primitive mobile phone or even flip phone use here?
Didn't catch any.
No, it's all walkie-talkies, isn't it?
Yeah, I was a little surprised we didn't even see like a primitive cell phone at any point, given when this was made. And like, you know, you're not seeing like the average Joe in this movie. You're seeing like government officials and scientists in the military, and like no early mobile phones.
I've just remembered there is a mobile phone incident where they're at the reception and Drumlin's on his mobile because they're getting told that there's been a leak. There's been a leak, hasn't there, about
that?
Yeah.
I'd forgot about that.
I've just remembered it, but that's the only recollection I've got for a use of a mobile phone.
It counts.
Okay.
Yeah.
It does count. Yeah. Okay, cool. Finally then, is there a conventional / romantic happy ending?
Yes.
Yeah. More or less,
I'd say so, really. Yeah. Not sort of romantic. Romantic in one sense, I think. You know. For Ellie, you know, in certain ways. So yeah, I definitely think it's definitely happy ending, isn't it? You know, she gets that closure with her father in many ways. You know, there's the hope that will come of what comes next. She's happily just sitting there looking out over the Grand Canyon or whatever it is with her. Yeah. I'd say definitely happy.
I do like the fact that the theme of science versus religion is ambiguously answered in the fact that Palmer goes, you know, me and Dr. Arroway have different ways of looking for the truth, but we are both seekers of truth, and I, for one, believer. So there's a nice resolution of the themes, as well as a kind of romantic ending as well there. So I like the kind of resolution of those two bits together.
Yeah, does a bit of both, doesn't it, there? Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so tropes out of 10 then. Contact scores 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 out of 10 on the trope scale. So that's above average then. That's above average on the trope. Now I didn't think Contact was going to ratchet up that many.
Yeah,
it is a soft six. I agree.
There are two in there that I think are very disputable.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, okay. So soft 6, fine. Yeah. And tropes aren't always a bad thing. I'm not necessarily saying this is a bad scale.
Sure.
It's just whether or not it hits some of these very 90s beats. You know, some of these I've got no issue with at all. You know, some I do, some I don't. So yeah, great stuff. So yeah, number 6 on the trope scale for Contact. Right, final thoughts then, guys, generally, and asking you the question, which I'm going to ask everyone on the podcast, is Contact a hit? Is it a miss? Or is it a classic? Ian, I think you previously said it was a classic. Do you stand by
It's
that?
a classic for me on a personal level. If I'm taking, you know, if I'm trying to assess it objectively, I will say it is at the very least a hit. As far as 90s movies go, it for me, for a lot of personal reasons, it is a classic.
What about you, Luke?
I'm pretty much the same. It's a classic for me personally. It's definitely a hit movie. It has a very it has a personal connection for me, and also I like any film or TV show that does the science versus religion debate, because I think it's a never-ending debate. It's two completely different ways of looking at the meaning of life and looking at understanding the world around you, and I like the fact that these two ways of doing that are debated in film and in television, and that's why I like it. And then on a personal level, you know, I think essentially it's about loneliness and feeling alone, and about kind of also saying that, you know, we aren't alone as a species, as individuals, and also to kind of utter the words that Ellie's dad and Palmer Joss and Ellie say, is that there has to be something out there, otherwise it would be an awful waste of space.
Yeah, it's a lovely sentiment, that, actually. Yeah, it's lovely. And that carries through the whole film, doesn't it? Yeah. It's just the little things like that I love. I'm going to say classic as well. Absolutely. Contact is 100% one of the greatest movies of the 90s. One of my personal favourites. And it's little things like the fact that when she goes to that beach at the end, that's the beach she draws when she's a kid.
Yeah.
You know, so they take, and that would be so easy not to spot at the very beginning. But when you see that, certainly after you've watched it more than once, I wouldn't expect anyone to make that connective necessarily first time round. But once you've watched it at least once more, you see that and you go, of course, that's because they took all the memories and they like he says, we wanted to make this easy for you, so there's just little things in there that I just think are beautifully done. It is just a beautiful movie on so many levels. There are elements to it, I'm sure, that have dated a bit, like we've talked about, some elements that are imperfect. But it is.
Good
I think it's a great. Yeah, righto.
Righto.
Exactly. Just Australian accents aside, this is a classic.
Yeah, definitely.
So and it has been a joy to rewatch it for I can't remember the amount. I mean, what number I'm on now, but it's been a joy to rewatch it with you guys for the first episode of At the Movies in the 90s. So thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me about this. Let's wrap up with a brief notice as to where they can find what else you guys are up to. So, Luke, where best can you be found?
You could find me on my website at lukewinch.com. That'll have links to all my We Made This podcast shows and also my YouTube channel and my blog. If it still exists, I can be found on Twitter because the way things are going at the minute, it's going to implode. But you can find me there at Luke_Winch if it still exists as a platform.
Fantastic. Ian, you're not really a social media man, are you? But there are ways people can at least listen to you.
Yeah, you can definitely hear me elsewhere on the network. We mentioned We Are Starfleet. I'm also co-host of Illumination Above All, our Severance discussion podcast. And I pop up elsewhere on the network, Movieversaries. I occasionally update a Star Wars podcast called The Way. It's if you just check in on the We Made This network feed, type my name in, you can find my appearances.
Fantastic. And as I said at the top, guys, you can find me at Linktr.ee /AJ Blackwriter, and you can get a bit more about me and the podcast there. But thank you for joining us for this first episode. Hopefully you've liked what you've heard and you'll enjoy more. The plan is to try and keep these coming as much as possible and tap into so many amazing 90s movies, maybe some of the ones that are less well known at the same time. So there's a whole gamut of things that are coming. So there's some great conversations to be had and a lot of trips down memory lane, hopefully, for you all. So thank you for listening. And if you want to support me and the podcast network generally that we're on, We Made This, more so, you can go to patreon.com /We Made This and help us out there. So thank you so much if you do. Next week for our second episode, we're going to grab ourselves some toast, and go into 1996's thrilling modern reimagining of the 1960 series Mission Impossible. So stay tuned for a taste of that film in just a moment. My thanks again to Luke and Ian. I can't wait to see you again, guys, on this podcast. And thanks to everyone for listening. Join me next time at the movies in the 90s.
Good morning, Mr. Phelps. This is your mission should you choose to accept it. Should you or any member of your IM force be caught or killed, the Secretary will disavow all knowledge of your actions. Ethan Hunt will be your point man as usual. Good luck, Jim.
Simple game. Is he serious?
Always.
It's much worse than you think.
We're being ambushed. Abort, that's an order. They knew we were coming. Do you read me?
I don't care how he did it. I want to know why he did it. You're worried about me. Why you survived.
I'm sure we can find something I have that you need.
Who sent you? No one sent me.
These guys are trained to be ghosts. Let's not waste time chasing after him. Just make him come to us. Find something that's personally important to him, and you squeeze.
This whole operation was a decoy.
I can understand you're very upset.
You've never seen me very upset.
This tape will self-destruct in 5 seconds.